Hello, HIST 340. It's good to see you again. It's been 2 weeks. I hope you're all well and safely distanced, etc. I've heard from most of you one way or the other over the last few weeks. So it's good to be back. So before jumping into today's topic, just a couple of sort of housekeeping things. First of all, as I believe you all know, your midterm exam is due today, so I'm recording this on Wednesday the 8th. Uploaded to Blackboard. I see here, I'm looking at Blackboard, that many of you have already submitted it. If you have, thank you. If you haven't, you have until the end of the day today, 11:59 p.m. to do so. If you're having any issues with uploading it or anything else going on, please contact me and we can discuss issues and work out a way for us to overcome those issues. Just looking forward, besides the midterm examination, moving into next week, we're sort of back on our normal schedule. I'll be creating videos on Monday. So next week, that'll be April the 13th. And you'll have your discussion board posts, which will be posted on the Wednesday, which is next week, April the 15th. For today, for this week, I should say, I'm not going to have a discussion board post for two reasons. One, you are working on your midterm examination, which again is due today by the end of the day. But two, because I know that there are religious holidays this weekend. So I'm not going to ask you to respond to a post by the end of this week. So, and I think we're doing the midterm exam is enough writing. So this week I just want you to watch this video. And the purpose of it is really to set up the next 2 weeks in which we discuss the Civil War itself and the effect that it had on the American nation, certainly on the American Constitution, moving into the latter part of the 19th century. And indeed, and we'll talk about this the very last week of class, which is week 16, May 11 and May 13th, the ways in which the Civil War and its aftermath have affected the United States all the way till today. So the purpose of today's talk is to discuss, as it's called here, the constitutional crisis, slavery, states' rights, and secession. So it's really to discuss the last few years of the 1850s, really the years from 1857 until early 1861. And that's a really short time period, of course, and shorter than other time periods that we've talked about week to week. Excuse me. But I hope it goes without saying that it's an incredibly important time period in United States history. And in many ways, I think it's the most important period of American constitutional history from the creation and ratification of the Constitution all the way till today. This 4 to 5 year period, 1857 to 1861, was first of all the biggest test of the Constitution, certainly as it was initially created and envisioned by the so-called framers in 1787. And it's also, aside from being the biggest test of the Constitution from its creation, you could think of it as its biggest failure, because this time period that we're discussing today, as we know, and as we'll talk about just in my camera, the next 2 weeks, the failure of the Constitution led directly to the Civil War. And in particular, it's the failure of the Constitution, but more importantly, the failure of the framers of the Constitution going back to the 1780s, 1787, 1788, to deal with the question of slavery in a way that prevented sectional discord, right? Conflict between the free states of the North and the slave states of the South. And obviously that's a theme we've talked quite a bit about. That was the major theme for the first video I did, which was 2 weeks ago. And so what I want to do is build on that discussion and talk about what I think are the main issues that led to the Civil War from the perspective of the Constitution. And in fact, the way I want to start this off is actually to read a quotation from text, The Blessings of Liberty, Michael S. Benedict. I haven't referred to it for a couple of weeks, so I want to pull it back out. And I want to just read from the very last paragraph on page 178, if you have it with you, 178. because I think there are two questions that he lays out that are put better than I can. So I'm going to take a sip of water. And I'll just read from the very last paragraph. Secession, meaning the seceding of slave states from the South ultimately to form the Confederacy, which will be the end point of today's class and the beginning point of the next class next week. Secession raised the most basic issues of federalism, right? The relationship between the national and state governments as constructed by the Constitution. These are the two questions that I think are the main questions for today. What was the nature of the federal system and the Constitution that sanctioned it? Was the Constitution, as Southerners argued, a compact among the sovereign people of each of the states, creating a central government that could act only as their agent? And I'll add one more question, or was that not the case? And I think we'll see clearly the two very divergent views, which we began discussing last week, between the sections, between the free states of the North and the slave states of the South, with reference to slavery. In particular, in the two primary source documents that I have for this week, which I'm going to read from at some length soon. The Declaration of the Immediate Causes, this is a long title, which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the federal union, meaning the first declaration of secession from the first state that seceded from the United States, which was South Carolina. This is in December of 1860. And the second document, Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address, which was March 4th, 1861. I think we'll clearly see the ultimately irreconcilable differences between these interpretations of the Constitution. As we've discussed going back several weeks, the anti-slavery and pro-slavery view of the Constitution. So I want to pick up with the Dred Scott decision, and I know we talked about that last class, and I just want to refer to it briefly, just by way of sort of introducing us into this later period of the 1850s. And as you've read, and as I discussed at length, I don't want to go into too much detail, the Dred Scott decision was a blatantly pro-slavery decision, which declared that slavery, as it pertained to the Constitution, was legal throughout the United States, could not be prevented from expanding into Western territories, and two, that African Americans could not, nor ever should have, political and civil rights in the United States. And as we mentioned, this was a decision that was extremely divisive because it was so blatantly pro-slavery. The aftermath of the Dred Scott decision is the real starting point here, because as Benedict discusses on pages 174 and 175, it had the unintended effect, meaning the unintended effect from the perspective of Southern Democrats led by Roger Taney, who, as we discussed last week or 2 weeks ago, was the pro-slavery Supreme Court Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who wrote the decision. It actually had the unintended effect of beginning a process of splitting the Democratic Party into two, into a southern wing of the Democratic Party, which was blatantly pro-slavery, clearly representing the interests of slaveholders, a southern wing of the Democratic Party, which was controlled by extremely radical pro-slavery politicians who were called fire eaters, and that's a term that pops up repeatedly in this chapter. Fire eater, again, being pro-slavery radicals, and a northern wing of the Democratic Party, which was pro-slavery in as much as they, as members of the Democratic Party, previously had shared a party with slaveholders, but because they lived in the free states of the North, were not slaveholders themselves, but Northern Democrats, led by a man named Stephen Douglas, believed in white male supremacy. So that's a view that they shared with slaveholders, but who also believed that, with reference to the question of slavery and expansion, in the concept of popular sovereignty, which is a term that I talked about 2 weeks ago, that the settlers of a territory should be responsible for either making legal or preventing slavery from expanding into their territory. The Dred Scott decision began a process, as Michael Les Benedict, there we go, points out on page 175, of splitting the Democratic Party into two different wings and ultimately two different parties. This will become important in the election of 1860. It's what allowed, just saw that Bernie Sanders is dropping out of the race, would become key for the election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency in 1860. That's something I'll talk about just very briefly in a little bit later. But that is a transition in discussing the Republican Party. And I talked about it last video lecture 2 weeks ago, and I just want to reiterate a couple of points before we get into the primary source documents for this week and begin to think about the constitutional conditions that ultimately led to the outbreak of civil war. So as I mentioned last week and want to reiterate here and expand upon today, the Republican Party was a sectional party, meaning it was a party that only found adherents in the North, the free states of the North, which simply put was anti-slavery. Most Republicans, people who gravitated to the Republican Party, and this is true of Abraham Lincoln, believed that slavery should not be allowed to expand into Western territories. And this was a stance called non-extension, EXTENSION, non-extension, as a core principle, right, that the United States government, for reasons we talked about 2 weeks ago, had an obligation to prevent slavery from expanding. This is called the freedom principle. But they also believed in something called non-interference, as if to interfere with something, non-interference, which meant that, and this is very, very much the case with Lincoln, and we see it in his first inaugural address, they believed that while the national government, in particular Congress, had an obligation to prevent slavery from expanding, at the same time, the National Congress in particular, and the national government as a whole, the executive branch and the judicial branch, could not interfere with slavery where it already existed, which is to say the states that already existed, which had already made slavery a legal institution, which, as we discussed, was an institution made legal through state law. And this goes all the way back to the understandings of the Constitution that both Northern Republicans and Southern Democrats shared. One thing that they shared was this principle of non-interference. Another way of putting it, which we've seen, which I've talked about, which I've written on the board, is called the federal consensus, that the Constitution cannot prevent or cannot force a state to abolish slavery, while at the same time it cannot force a state to make slavery legal again. This is non-interference. And this is important, and it's something that's been confusing to scholars for a very long time, since Abraham Lincoln died in 1865 and in the aftermath of the Civil War. And it's, I think, still true today. How could the Republican Party be anti-slavery, be against the extension of slavery, be against, and others we've talked about, the idea of rendition of fugitive slaves who ran away from the southern slave states to the northern free states, but also believe that they could not interfere with slavery where it existed. It's only makes sense, these positions, if we are reminded of the federal consensus. Because it's possible to read Abraham Lincoln's speeches, and we're going to talk about one in a second, and come away with the impression that he was not anti-slavery. The only way to understand that is to understand that Abraham Lincoln, like all other Republicans, recognized and upheld the federal consensus. Now, the one difference, or the one point I would make, not difference, but the point I would make, and this is something we're going to talk about next class, or next week. I keep thinking we're meeting in class. That we'll talk about next week when we discuss the Civil War itself, is that the federal consensus only held true in times of peace. In times of war, which of course the Civil War was, the federal consensus did not hold any longer, which will help us understand the process of emancipation during the war, which is the theme of next week's class. So Abraham Lincoln, and by extension the Republican Party, is a little bit difficult to interpret sometimes. Was Abraham Lincoln an anti-slavery moderate, or was he more of a radical? And we're going to think about these questions when we discuss his first inauguration speech. But the point I want to make now very clearly, drink some water first. Much better. Is that Abraham Lincoln was clearly, and I want there to be no doubt about this, an explicitly anti-slavery in his personal beliefs. He made this clear going all the way back to the 1830s when he first became a politician at the Illinois state level. He gave speeches for 30 years up until his death in 1865, from the middle of the 1830s until 1865, in which he consistently said, "I have always been against slavery." And I bring that up here because when we get to his first inaugural address, we'll point out some things that might sound confusing unless we have an understanding of the federal consensus, and also just have made clear that he was anti-slavery personally in his philosophical and moral, and well, he wasn't particularly religious. He was called a deist, but in his philosophical and moral beliefs. So by the end of the 1850s and leading into the 1860 election, it was clear to most people who were paying attention, aka everybody in the United States, that there was a looming conflict. It wasn't clear that it would become a war, but it was clear that the 1860 election would be a major pivot point. And indeed it was. And just very quickly, before we get to the two primary sources for today, the 1860 election was unique in that four candidates ran. Well, one was Abraham Lincoln, who was the Republican Party candidate. He was relatively unknown until 1858, unknown at the national level. Because in 1858, he gained popularity, or he gained renown. He became a national figure through a series of debates with Stephen Douglas, who I've already referred to, also from Illinois, the leader of the Northern Democratic Party. By 1860, Abraham Lincoln was chosen as the Republican Party candidate because he was widely perceived to be moderate in his anti-slavery views, going back to the question I just asked, although I think we'll see that he in fact was not. He was perceived to be moderate. Something that happens quite often, actually, still today in presidential elections, and we have one coming up, so we'll see. But often candidates are presented as moderate, even if they're not, if they're either radical or conservative. Repeating pattern in American history. The other two major candidates who ran, Stephen Douglas running as the candidate of the Northern Democratic Party, again, a party which upheld principles of white male supremacy and popular sovereignty, alongside a second Democratic candidate, now that the party had formally split, the so-called Southern Democratic Party, who ran a candidate named John Breckinridge, who was a fire eater, right, a pro-slavery radical. The fourth candidate ran in a party that only existed for this one election. His name was John Bell, B-E-L-L, and the party was called the Constitutional Union Party. This party was, again, short-lived, only existed for the one election, and it was created, and this will be explained more next week's lecture, to represent the interests of slave owners in the so-called upper South states, upper meaning geographically slave states farthest to the north, but particularly Kentucky, Maryland, and Virginia, three, who slaveholders from those states who did not believe that seceding from the United States was a wise idea. I'm going to talk more about those upper South states again next week when we discuss the process of emancipation and the Constitution during the war. But in short, and I think many of us know, Abraham Lincoln won the election. He won a majority of the Electoral College votes without winning a single Electoral College vote in the slave states of the South, both the lower South and the upper South. So this set in motion almost immediately the process of emancipation, or of secession, not emancipation, but secession. And this is very clear in the first primary source document that I want to discuss, which is not going to give you the full title again, the Declaration of Immediate Causes. The Declaration of Secession is usually what it's referred to, of South Carolina. Because in this document we see, as I started out this talk with the question from Michael S. Benedict, the Southern view of the Constitution as a compact amongst the sovereign people of each of the states, creating a central government, the national government, which could only act as the agent of the individual states. So this is usually referred to as the states' rights position. Another phrase to describe this constitutional theory, one that was developed first by John C. Calhoun, a South Carolina slaveholder, is called the compact theory. This is discussed earlier in Michael S. Benedict, and I've talked about it briefly, but compact, C-O-M-P-A-C-T, that the Constitution was primarily a compact, an agreement between the sovereign citizens of the sovereign individual states to band together to form a national government. And this is the core of the belief of the, again, pro-slavery fire eaters, but the core justification for the secession of the slave states, which would ultimately lead to form the Confederate States of America. So again, this begins with South Carolina as the first state to secede from the United States. This was in December of 1860, 3 weeks after Abraham Lincoln won the election of 1860 in November of 1860. So you can see that within a month's time, the process of secession begins. And this states' rights, or the more correct term for it, compact theory of the United States Constitution and therefore the United States government, as I said, was the underlying theory, the underlying justification for secession. I think this is made extremely clear in the Declaration of Secession. And so what I want to do now is pull out a couple of key passages that I think really make this point clear. And one thing that I want to start out with saying, and we'll also discuss this in the context of Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address, which we'll get to after shortly, is that both views, the anti-slavery and pro-slavery view, acknowledge the importance of the Declaration of Independence, but do so for very different reasons. So if we look at the Declaration of Secession, which again, I'll give you a chance to pull this up if you'd like. It's on Blackboard, on our Blackboard page under the Content tab. I'll just give you a second to do that before I start reading passages from it. I'll take that second to hydrate. And caffeinate. Hydrate and caffeinate. Okay, so if you don't have it up yet, pause, but I'm going to continue. From the very beginning of this Declaration of Sentiments, we see from the third clause, beginning in the year 1765, we see repeated references to the Declaration of Independence. And what's most significant about the Declaration of Secession's use of the Declaration of Independence as compared to Abraham Lincoln's use of the Declaration of Independence is that they draw from different sections of text from the Declaration of Independence to make their point. What you don't see in the Declaration of Secession is any mention of the phrase that all men are created equal, because slaveholders did not believe that. You don't see any references to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. what you see, and here I'll just read the third clause in this Declaration of Secession, is a reference to a separate section or a separate language of the Declaration of Independence. It says, in the year 1765, that portion of the British Empire embracing Great Britain undertook to make laws for the government of that portion composed of the 13 American colonies, referring to the imperial crisis. A struggle for the right of self-government ensued, and that's an important point, that they viewed the Declaration of Independence primarily as a vehicle to express the right of self-government. A struggle for the right of self-government ensued, which resulted on the 4th of July, 1776, in a declaration by the colonies, quote, that they are and of right ought to be free and independent states, and that as free and independent states, they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may have right to do. So that's the most important point for understanding the Confederate pro-slavery position, is that they view the Declaration of Independence not as one that expounds principles of freedom for individuals, but as one in which establishes the right that the individual states, the 13 original states, and moving forward through the 1850s, additional states, remained themselves sovereign. That's how they interpreted the Declaration of Independence. And they continue, this is the fifth section. In pursuance of this Declaration of Independence, each of the 13 original states proceeded to exercise its separate sovereignty, adopted for itself a constitution, state constitutions, and appointed officers for the administration of the government in all its departments. So they view the Declaration of Independence and, in fact, the American Revolution not as creating necessarily a coherent, unified country, but allowing the individual states to themselves become sovereign nations. Why did they make this interpretation of the Declaration of Independence? Because South Carolina, in this instance, was in the process of declaring itself seceding from the United States and establishing itself as a sovereign, independent nation. So their view of the Declaration of Independence very different than that of Abraham Lincoln, as we'll see. I'm going to move down now to the 7th section, where they being the South Carolina leaders of secession, sum up their views of the Declaration of Independence. They say, thus, in the Declaration of Independence, thus were established the two great principles asserted by the colonies, namely, first, the right of a state to govern itself, secondly, the right of a people to abolish a government when it becomes destructive of the ends for which it was instituted. That's very important. Okay, that's their vision of the American founding. The right of a state to govern itself, and the right of a people to abolish a government when it becomes destructive of the ends for which it was instituted. And I know that you're not with me right now in class because I would ask this question to you, but question is, for South Carolina pro-slavery fire eaters, what were the ends for which the government was constituted? Well, to protect private property, and more specifically, to protect slavery. This is their vision of the American founding. And this is the theme that they continue to develop in this Declaration of Secession. I'm not going to read every single section, but they view Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party as destructive of the ends to which they think the United States government was created and the Constitution was created, which was to protect slavery. They continue to argue that the northern states, the free states of the North, had violated the Constitution by violating its 4th article, the so-called Fugitive Slave Clause, which we've talked about. They continue to argue that northern unwillingness to allow fugitive slaves to be recovered, an issue we've talked about, northern opposition to the expansion of slavery from a constitutional perspective allowed them the legal right to secede from the United States. And they conclude near the end, For these reasons, on the 4th day of March next, meaning March 1861, so 3 months in the future, this party will take possession of the government, meaning pro-slavery fighters will take possession of the South Carolina government. It has announced that the South shall be excluded from the common territory, and that the judicial tribunals shall be made sectional, and that a war must be waged against slavery until it shall cease throughout the United States. This is what they believe the Republicans threatened, that they will exclude the South from the common territory, and that they will wage war against slavery until it shall cease throughout the United States. So, in other words, they viewed Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party as an existential threat to slavery. This, therefore, is why South Carolina seceded from the government of the United States to form a second nation called the Confederacy. And as I'll begin talking about next class, they were joined by 9 other states, but South Carolina was the first. Now, if we pivot to discussing the first inaugural address of Abraham Lincoln, we're going to see a very different view of the Declaration of Independence as it pertained to slavery. So I'll give you a second to pull that up. And I will also take another sip of water myself. So Abraham Lincoln, on Monday, March 4th, 1861, in his inaugural address, offers a very different view of the constitutional crisis that faced the United States with reference to slavery. And I want to begin with the 4th section in this because it again reiterates Abraham Lincoln's adherence to the federal consensus. And as I said earlier, it's one that has been somewhat confusing to scholars, subsequent scholars, and in general to United States citizens as a whole. Abraham Lincoln says, I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. Another way of saying that is that I don't intend to interfere with the federal consensus. I believe that I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. So as I said earlier, if you didn't understand the federal consensus, one could take that sentence to mean that Abraham Lincoln was not, in fact, anti-slavery, that he had no intention to do anything that would constitute interference or an attack on slavery. But that's incorrect, because, and I'm going to read here from page 177 of Michael S. Benedict, that wasn't necessarily true. Michael S. Benedict said here, I'm quoting page 177, in reality, in this inaugural address, Lincoln was maneuvering to make the fundamental issues clear to the people of the North. Neither the North nor the Republicans were the aggressors, he believed. This is very important. It was the slaveholders who refused to accept the result of a democratic election. Remembering that South Carolina had already seceded when he gave this inaugural address. It was the slaveholders, again, who refused to accept the result of a democratic election. It was they who acted on a theory of federalism that required Northerners to help maintain slavery as a price of union, and who were willing to wreck the Union when Northerners refused. So from the perspective of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party, and to many of the general public in the North, the fact that the South Carolina Declaration of Secession invoked a very different view of the Declaration of Independence, invoked a fear that Republicans might do something to interfere with slavery, and used those interpretations of both the Declaration of Independence and Republican expressions of anti-slavery sentiment to justify seceding from the United States, meant that it was the Southerners, the Confederates, who were at fault constitutionally for creating the crisis. It's very important because, to be fair, South Carolinians knew, because Abraham Lincoln had made clear that Lincoln could not interfere with slavery where it existed. So what in fact was the threat? And I'll lay out a few ideas before getting to the rest of Abraham Lincoln's inaugural address. What exactly did South Carolinians fear about Abraham Lincoln? Did they not believe him when he invoked the federal consensus? Maybe some didn't believe him, but it seems as if most South Carolina pro-slavery fire eaters, leaders of the secession movement, actually believed Abraham Lincoln when he said he believed in the federal consensus. But what could an anti-slavery president do? What could an anti-slavery Congress do? After secession, just to be very clear, United States Congress, the majority changed to a majority of Republicans. One of the unintended consequences, or if not unintended, one of the underplayed consequences of secession is that in seceding, beginning with South Carolina and eventually encompassing 9 other states, those states, by forming their own government, by definition, left Congress, and so they left a Congress that all of a sudden flipped to becoming an anti-slavery majority. So what can an anti-slavery president and an anti-slavery Congress do? They couldn't force a state to abolish slavery. They could abolish slavery in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., not a state, under the exclusive jurisdiction of Congress. So we abolish slavery in the nation's capital. They could, an anti-slavery president and Congress, use their authority to make the slave trade within the United States illegal. They could use their authority to make the African slave trade further suppressed, to suppress illegal trading in African slaves. They could, in general, implement policies that would lead to slavery withering away in the states where it already existed. This phrase doesn't appear in the text, but the most recent scholar of the subject has called it the cordon of freedom. An anti-slavery president and an anti-slavery Congress could surround the slave states with free states and free territories, prevent slavery from expanding, and therefore force slavery to devour itself where it already existed. They also called this the scorpion's sting. If you're not familiar with that metaphor, but a scorpion, when it is trapped and it is surrounded by opponents, adversaries, other predators, when it can't fight itself to freedom, it stings itself so that it will die. That's what Abraham Lincoln viewed the Republican project, the anti-slavery Republican project, as. We will force the South to abolish slavery by creating a government hostile to slavery and its expansion. We can't make a state abolish slavery, but we can create the conditions so that those states will eventually abolish it, because slavery will not be allowed to expand and remain productive. So these are the threats that the South Carolinians viewed, and they're threats that, if you have that understanding, are all throughout Abraham Lincoln's first inaugural address. He restates them repeatedly. So without understanding those ideas, the actual threat that Abraham Lincoln posed to the Confederate States of America, to the slave states, this speech reads as if Abraham Lincoln isn't particularly interested in abolishing slavery. But in fact, it's made very clear with that contextual understanding that Abraham Lincoln wasn't necessarily moderate, but was in fact, in some ways, leaning more towards being a radical. So I'll pull out a couple of quotations, further quotations from this, which I think buttress this view. And I will pull out first a quotation that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, should have written this down, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 paragraphs down, each paragraph in the link that I gave you being 1 or 2 sentences. It starts with again, and then a colon. This is Abraham Lincoln's view of anti-slavery in the Republican Party as it pertained to fugitive slavery. It says, again, in any law upon this subject, meaning the subject of fugitive slavery, in any law upon this subject ought not all the safeguards of liberty known in the civilized and humane jurisprudence to be introduced, so that a free man be not in any case surrendered as a slave? And might it not be well at the same time to provide by law for the enforcement of that clause in the Constitution, the Fugitive Slave Clause, that clause in the Constitution, the Due Process Clause, which guarantees that, quote, the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. How is that radical? Well, I'll paraphrase it for you and put it into context. Abraham Lincoln is saying that the United States government and through Congress should pass a law saying that everybody living in the United States should have, quote, or should be entitled to, quote, all privileges and immunities of the citizens in the several states. So in effect, what he's saying there, and this is how the slaveholders of the Confederacy, and before the creation of the Confederacy, slaveholders of the southern states of the United States viewed the Republican Party. They are threatening to declare all of our slaves citizens, therefore nullifying their status as slaves if they run into a free state. They viewed that as a threat. I know what the Republicans are really saying. They're saying that if a slave runs away, they're automatically free and they automatically become a citizen. Scary prospect for the slave owners, one of the reasons why secession occurred. Another quotation that I'll pull out, and it's from the farther to the bottom. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 from the bottom. So I'm reading from the bottom up. Count 9 from the last one. It begins with one section. So I'll let you find that quickly. Here Abraham Lincoln expresses the anti-slavery view of his anti-slavery views and anti-slavery views of Republicans as it pertained to the issue of expansion. It says, one section of our country believes that slavery is right and ought to be extended, aka the slave states of the South, while the other believes it is wrong and not ought to be extended. This is the only substantial dispute. The Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution and the laws for the suppression of the foreign slave trade are each as well enforced, perhaps, as any law can ever be in a community where the moral sense of the people imperfectly supports the law itself. The great body of the people abide by the dry legal obligation in both cases, and a few break over in each. This, I think, cannot be perfectly cured, and it would be worse in both cases after the separation of the sections than before. So he's saying, with reference to the issue of western expansion, you believe slavery should be able to expand because it's right, and I and other Northerners believe it should not. This is our big dispute. We agree that the Fugitive Slave Clause and the suppression of the forced slave trade should be enforced. And here's the key point. This, I think, just to read this line again, cannot be perfectly cured, and it would be worse in both cases after the separation of the sections than before. That doesn't sound threatening, but what Abraham Lincoln said is that because the sections have already begun separating, meaning South Carolina and other slave states have already begun leaving to form the Confederacy, there is no more Fugitive Slave Clause. We will not enforce a Fugitive Slave Clause, we being the northern states. Slaves run away to us, they're free. End of discussion. And to expand a little bit farther on that, and this will be the beginning of the next video lecture, Abraham Lincoln and other Republicans understood that because of secession, beginning with South Carolina, what the states who left to form the Confederacy had actually done was free the Union states of the North to begin abolishing slavery. We can confiscate fugitive slaves. And next class, next week, we'll talk about wartime actions of emancipation. they have removed themselves from all the protections under the national government. There is no federal consensus anymore. They have left the country. So this sets the conditions, this creates the conditions, not sets them, creates the conditions for what would be wartime emancipation. That's the subject of next class. So I will stop there for today. I hope some of the constitutional issues here have become clear now that we have reached secession. And we'll talk about the war itself next class. For next class, there is no reading from the Blessings of Liberty, but I'm asking us to read, and these are both under content, which were not in the original syllabus, but which I've added to the post-corona online syllabus, are the First and Second Confiscation Acts, which are under the content tab on Blackboard. So for next week, just read those. In the meantime, finish up your midterms. They are due today. But as I said, if you're having tech issues or any other kind of issues that are preventing you from submitting it today, just get in contact with me and you can, and we'll figure out a solution. Like I said, there's no discussion board response since you've done enough writing this week. So if you've submitted your midterm, great, thank you, and I'll have graded them by the next video lecture. If you haven't, make sure you get it done. But most importantly, all of you continue to be safe, and I will see you through video again next week. Okay, have a great weekend.